Don't worry, folks, this isn't going to be the permanent intro theme.
Sitting in my little room, such serious isolation. The world is just a fading light away. Contain it all inside myself and hope for desolation.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude, not far from the redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is squatting on the floor, watching Buttons try to get in one of the kitchen cabinets. Stop that. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and he's cats. Get over it. This episode features my interview with Bruce Carlson from the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast. Since Bruce often puts the shows he's on in his regular feed, and his podcast doesn't have a lot of swearing, I figured that I ought to change the intro tune for this episode so his listeners aren't hit with an F-bomb right out of the gate. The music you heard is called Serious Isolation, and it's by the Lemming Shepherds. I got it from freemusicpublicdomain.com for another project I'm trying to work on when I have the time, which seems like never at the moment. I've been doing this show for a little over 3 years now, and while I've often been eager to record a show, I've never been so eager to post one as I have with this episode. Part of it is simply because I got to talk to someone whose work as a podcaster I've admired for years. Bruce's show really sets a high bar for what a podcast can be. Not only does he tell you about parts of history you might be unfamiliar with, he doesn't try to shape the narrative to fit his political beliefs, which is important when you're trying to use history to illustrate how we can learn from what's happened before to make better decisions now. Another reason why I've been so eager to post this episode is because of something he and I talked about during the interview. I won't spoil the discussion, but suffice it to say that after the conversation he and I had, I was looking at some news stories which came out later and thinking, yep, Bruce nailed it. The final reason why I'm so excited to get this episode up and out there is that I have to thank listener Gretchen for her very generous donation to the podcast. She's covered the amount I asked for to help me redo the deck and take care of the cats. I literally never expected anyone to be so generous. It helps a massive amount so I can finally start moving on doing and getting some of the things I need done. I had hoped to be able to say that her donations would cover everything, and in fact, I thought that was the case until this morning. I took Buttons to get her second round of vaccinations. Everything went well, but the cost was a bit higher than what I thought they had told me it was going to be. Not a huge issue, but I did remember to ask for an estimate on what it would cost to get her spayed. This time they gave me a printout and the price was a lot higher than I expected. I thought that it was only going to cost about $150 to get her taken care of. Turns out that the actual cost is going to vary between about $200 and $260. Ouch. I'll post a pic of the estimate in the show notes. I could probably get it done cheaper elsewhere, but that would require me to have a car. Then, as I was walking home, I ran into one of my neighbors who claimed that the landlord was going to be raising the rent of folks who have pets. $50 a month per animal. I haven't heard anything from the landlord about this, so I don't know if it's true or not. If it is, I'm pretty much boned because I can't really afford an extra $100 a month for rent. I'll keep you posted on that. I did look through the latest mailing that the landlord sent out and didn't see anything about it in there. He was, however, complaining about people having messy yards. Mine's not exactly neat, as I've got some of the lumber from work piled up in the yard. It's tucked out of sight, so you can't see it from the street, but I'm sure he's not happy about it. The only way I can put more of the lumber in my storage shed is if I cut it down, and to do it right, I need the table saw. I went to order that and discovered that the model I had wanted to get is out of stock. All the others in that price range on Amazon had terrible reviews. Lowe's had an even worse selection than Amazon did, so I wound up buying one that was $90 more from Amazon that had fairly decent reviews. It's supposed to be here on Wednesday. All of which means I'm now not certain that I'll have enough money to do everything. I'll certainly be able to get button spayed and get the lumber cut down and out of sight. And I might be able to put off a few things related to fixing the deck roof to save a few bucks. For example, there's not an urgent need, I don't think, for me to install the flashing on the deck roof this year. That won't cut out a lot of expenses, of course, but it will save some. We'll just have to see. Still, I really can't thank Gretchen and the others of you who've helped me out with this and other things over the years. I've said before that it's hard to think about doing something when you've no idea if you'll ever have the money to complete the task. Working on it in fits and starts is difficult because each time you start back up, you have to spend so much time trying to remember what you were doing the last time you were able to work on the project, if you can remember it at all. Or you discover that something you thought was going to be fairly cheap and easy is neither. And you have to wonder if you shouldn't just write off what you've already spent and do something else. Now, I admit that I can't be certain my idea of using scrap lumber from work to fix the deck roof will do the trick. I may start getting into it and realize that there's flaws with my plans, but at least now I can try. And I should be able to figure it out before I get too far into the project and have spent too much money on it. So if I have to do something else, it won't be the impossible struggle it seemed like it would be up until now. Studies have shown that being poor sucks up a lot of the mental bandwidth a person has, so it becomes hard for them to think about much more than being poor. This often creates a feedback loop where they do things which only add to their level of poverty, because they can't step back from their situation to analyze it. It's one of the reasons why drug abuse and poverty are so closely linked. The drugs help you quiet that part of your brain which is screaming about not being able to make the rent, pay the electric bill, or whatever for at least a little while. So thanks again to all of you who've helped me out. You not only enable me to begin to deal with the problems at hand, you've no doubt helped me free up enough bandwidth so that I don't quite make so many stupid decisions going forward. I think that's enough of my prattling. Let's get to my interview with Bruce Carlson. My guest today is Bruce Carlson, the host of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, which is one of my favorite podcasts out there. Welcome to the show, Bruce.
Tucker, great to be here.
All right. Since you specialize in taking contemporary events in American politics and comparing them to things which happened in the country's past, I figured that the best topic to start out with is the change that happened in American political discourse sometime after the 19th century. I know that in the 19th century, things could be pretty vicious, yet until fairly recently, if someone had tried to level the kinds of accusations politicians routinely threw out at one another in the 19th century, their political career would immediately be over. How and when did we switch to more polite politics, and what do you think we need to do to get back to such a place?
Yeah, great question, and it's really a complex and interesting thing to look at. It's not necessarily so linear. But I think the general thing to understand, really both for today and for the past, is to just think about America. And you, I think, in being in the kind of the middle of the country, understand it more than many of my Eastern or West Coast friends. But America, rough country, rough settlement, not an easy place to live necessarily. That doesn't mean people weren't happy to come and happy to leave Europe, the central point of emigration. They're happy to come here, but it was a rough land. It had to be settled, and that can sound kind of hokey a little bit in generalization, but I think it's really true, and you have to consider it when considering history. I also think it was a relatively poor country. Maybe not everyone was destitute, especially if they were farmers and had the ability to provide a living for themselves that way. It was a poor country. And so start bringing that into the politics. And I just think when people are more well off, more there's more education, more access to education, more access to health care. Debates calm down a bit. But during the early part of the history, it was a rough country. You also have to remember participation in politics was generally male. And so you saw that kind of stump politics all throughout the country. When people went to political rallies, they wanted to be entertained. When people spoke, they often didn't, speak in the most flattering tones about people. They said what they felt. Disagreements became heated, I think, because stakes were high. And so all of those things, I think, are a good background to consider it. And you do have to remember, too, that in the 18th and early 19th century, some of the attacks made in politics were done under disguise. Or, most of the battles over the Constitution were by people named Publius or Columbian Patriot or Cato and Brutus. So they were disguised behind a mask. And but that made you able to be to attack your opponents in insulting ways. And also there was the dueling culture. So the kind of ceiling or floor on what you could say was determined by the fact that you might have to answer for it in a duel. And that really runs all the way through for colonial times, through the Revolution, through the post-Revolution early American Republic, all the way really up to the Civil War. There's still some element of dueling culture, kind of being the key thing that's controlling political rhetoric. And so just some of the things that Lincoln was called, let's see, this is just filthy storyteller, despot, liar, thief, braggart, buffoon, usurper, monster, ignoramus, old scoundrel, perjurer, swindler, tyrant, field butcher, and my favorite, land pirate. And that's just one article in Harper's Magazine. George Washington was compared to a common thief or a Nero, like a pickpocket, and of course by anonymous people, and really not that many, but it still bothered him greatly. And so, but then even though Lincoln got attacked, he's at a speech, he made his career kind of as a cutter, or a guy that would kind of cut down people in some real prairie stump speeches for the Whig Party in Illinois. And so he attacks Pierce, attacks him about being a general and repeating a story that probably wasn't true about how the biggest thing that happened to him during the Mexican War is that his horse fainted. That I should say that he fainted and fell off his horse. Maybe the horse fainted as well in some versions of the story. Whether that's true or not, it was something that was spread around in the same way as, say, the president's small hands, or things like jokes like that, or comments about Elizabeth Warren and Native American ancestry, or things like that. So we did have a rich culture of this type of politics. At one point, Abraham Lincoln. This is not a speech you hear repeated a lot because it doesn't work with the Lincoln narrative. But he was younger. It was 1852 during that campaign. He compares Pierce to a mulatto slave because he's half abolitionist and half not. And Lincoln's actually hinting that Pierce is a secret abolitionist to try to sway votes in Illinois, a crucial state. So you had this kind of stump speech mentality and that kind of politics. People entered the political theater, very aggressively in those times. And I just think it is the increased education, it is the increased law enforcement manners, the development of the country, the settlement of the country that changes that.
So, in theory, if we get better off economically, more people have access to education, our discourse levels will be more genteel. I
think that's at least what explains a good portion of of the background for the political record in the past. Now, it doesn't always fit neatly into those centuries either, that straight linear line. Now, I before we talked, I was thinking a bit about the 1928 election in this context, and now you have an election where the 20s, at least they considered themselves very modern, and it really is the point of modernization of America. You have automobiles, you have better schooling. We're moving from the one-room schoolhouses to more regional school systems. You have school buses. You have radio. And yet, there was a real dark side to that 1928 campaign. Now, it didn't come, as you might imagine, from, say, Herbert Hoover speaking about his opponent, Al Smith himself. No, I mean, Herbert Hoover was one of these guys that the reporters used to say that they would ask him a question, and he would answer the question, and maybe a sentence or so, and then they'd be expecting for him to say something else. And as one reporter indicated, it was like a machine that had run, and that was all you got. And so it wasn't him being colorful, where Al Smith was a very colorful candidate that he was running against. There were certainly no debates of any kind. But there was a darker side to the ground troops kind of in the campaign, and particularly people that were associated with the Ku Klux Klan and making comments about Smith, who was a Catholic, but not just the Klan. I mean, the Klan was kind of like the kind of easy target in all this, but there was also some local level Republican literature that would say, or Protestant ministers would say, if Smith's elected, if you don't have a Catholic marriage, you don't have a marriage at all. He's going to declare all of the children of the marriages illegitimate if they're not Catholic. Other Republicans called him Alcoholic Smith. I mean, because the guy liked to take a cocktail now and then from his pre-prohibition legal stash. As long as you had the stash buried, it was legal. It was before the Volstead Act. And he was a supporter. He was a wet. He was a supporter of the removal of prohibition. So they turned that into Alcoholic Smith. So a lot of this sinisterness has always been with us, and it's part of our ribald politics.
Yeah, I know that in the 2000 Republican primary, people were accusing John McCain of having an illegitimate daughter, which was...
There's a dark side, and it goes farther back, even in our modern politics. I think Lee Atwater's a good one to look at here, and bringing that kind of dark, sinister politics. Like, look, he freely admitted, I have nothing to run against for most of the people I'm running against. And South Carolina at that time was very Democratic. He was a Republican operative, and so he would just make stuff up.
Yeah.
I mean, and
as I recall, he apologized for that on his deathbed.
Yeah, he right before the 92 election, a lot of people say if Lee Atwater was around, there might not have been a Bill Clinton. I mean, they went after Clinton anyway, but not a skilled operator as Lee Atwater was. And there's some debate about this thing, by the way. If you talk to like Mary Madeline, she's going to say that the deathbed confessions happened, but it was, a guy that was dying of cancer, and who knows, how he really felt, kind of thing. But other people, he sent letter to the people in South Carolina that he felt he had wronged. He sent a letter to Mike Dukakis, whose presidential campaign, he had engineered that strategy and that kind of Willie Horton ad, and he apologized to him. Dukakis received a letter. So that certainly did happen, and perhaps he did really feel bad. He did bring up some things that were evident in politics. I mean, one, a very sinister and dark level of politics, but also a little bit of heuristics and gut feelings and small emotional tones that you're seeing in the politics today. Now, very few things are new. My podcast, My History Could Beat Up Your Politics, is what we talk about all the time. I mean, I would see that same thing in, say, the 64 campaign against Barry Goldwater, where Lyndon Johnson just went after him, and the Daisy ad, for instance. So it made no statement. It was just a girl, pulling the petals of a flower. and then something that sounded like Barry Goldwater's voice, counting off and sounding like he was counting off an explosion, but it was giving you this emotional jar. And Lee Atwater realized that was important. And he saw Mike Dukakis, and I heard him interviewed, and he just looked at the guy in khakis and the way that he carried himself and said, "This is not a man. We're just gonna take this guy down. The South isn't gonna vote for this guy." And he found ways to do that, but it wasn't a erudite discussion of labor policy that sunk Dukakis in the '88 election.
Yeah, it was the Willie Horton ad played over and over again. And
so I think that we're better in some ways, maybe than our 19th century cousins in some of the direct attacks, and depending on really with a wide range, depending on the high, the level of the height of the position that you had and the region of the country that you lived in and who the audience was, whether it was a local audience or a national one. If you were on the floor of the Senate, or if you were in a stump in western Tennessee, as say former President Andrew Johnson was, you would make a speech differently. But in some ways, we haven't changed.
Speaking of Andrew Johnson, with all the swirling issues surrounding Trump at the moment, I know a lot of people compare the current crop to Nixon's Watergate scandals, but would Johnson or Andrew Jackson's presidency be a better match?
Better match. I think Andrew Johnson, in many ways, is probably your best model. The way that he spoke, his lack of control. I mean, I was reading a passage recently where, in a speech, he started calling on the audience to take a shot at him. What, do you want another martyr? You want another president assassinated? Like, he was just a very gruff person who couldn't control what he said. And yet, swirling around him, and this is very close to, I think, what's going on in the situation, there were some people who legitimately agreed with his political stance. And that's the reason I think he got acquitted. Other reasons, too. And he had some supporters. For a while, Grant was at least behind him as president, and Seward really never gave up supporting him. So you had these people that were kind of legitimate political actors supporting him, but then you had this guy that was a wild, probably a drunk. Drunk gets thrown around a lot, and again, it's one of these things, 19th century versus 20th and 21st, in the frontier or in the interior of the country, it was the safest water to drink sometimes. People would do it for medicinal reasons. So it's hard to tell whether some of this was, the guy was a drunk, or it's a mixture maybe. Also just being kind of a wild, uncontrolled speaker. Nixon is interesting. A lot of people talk about Nixon. One thing to remember is, we're looking back as moderns, and we have access to those tapes, and we have access to the hindsight of Watergate. Most of what Americans experienced, the President Nixon they experienced, was a very calm, collected speaker who really, spoke well and gave good, solid speeches and carefully considered what he was saying, until really Watergate started to unravel a little bit of that, and then he was like, "Your president's not a crook," started to get jumbled. And then we hear the tapes, and we know what he was saying in the background, but that was in the background. So Nixon wasn't like a tweeter,
Yeah. So, sort of unrelated here. When you've been doing research for your podcast, have you ever thought that you had something that was a good match for a contemporary issue, but after you dug into it deeper, realized that it just wouldn't work?
Yeah, I think that just not even just in a comparison of one thing to another, but just in all of my podcast and the research we do for comparing events from the past to today, it's very important you can start out with a little bit of a hypothesis, but don't make it a thesis, because if that's going to start to affect the research, and I almost always find new and interesting things. And if I find something that disproves the thesis I have, I run with that. I don't, I let the history decide on that front. I don't think it's as hard as some people think it might be. Yeah, there's different sources, and sources have a little bit of a bias. I try to use older history books for the reason that they do avoid contemporary debates. They might be biased by the debates of their day, but they avoid at least the contemporary debates, which is hard if you're reading books now or magazine articles now. They're often shaped. Like, you can't read an article about impeachment right now to talk about impeachment. You got to go back and read the older stuff because they're all kind of oriented towards either Clinton or Trump right now. And you want to read the older stuff and really study the issues involved with impeachment. So I think that I try to do that. We try to go with multiple sources. But the main thing is really just to let the history go. And if you find that, if I found that actually Andrew Johnson was cold, calm, and collected, and everybody respected his decisions on the cabinet, but that he got a bad rap in history, I'd go out with that. But you don't. I think the reality is it might be kind of similar to what's going on today. There were a lot of people arguing, hey, all right, Andy goes on the stump and it looked bad and it's been horrible for him politically, but we agree with this kind of moderate course of Reconstruction. There's a lot of opinion in the North that agreed with them. They thought he really did poorly in the 1866 midterm elections for supporters of the president, which mostly would have been Democrats at that point, even though he had marginally run as a Union Republican. He did a little better in the 1867 elections. There was some opinion coming towards him, and then the impeachment effort. So I think that the people around him, the cabinet, the Sewards, were trying to make it work. There was a short time that Ulysses S. Grant, who's a good figure to judge this, trying to make it work, and then just some of them had to give up. Some, like Seward, never gave up. And there were some others in the cabinet, Lincoln's cabinet, who stayed. But I don't think they stayed because this is a great leader. It's just this is the best political situation right now. I think it's very similar. There's never a one-to-one comparison in history. That's not what it should be about. We should never think that history can't be different, or that the future can't be different from history, is what I should say.
Yeah. Which brings me to another question. Way back when, 20 years or so ago, when we really started to see what the internet was capable of, I wanted a website which was sort of like your podcast is, only not focused strictly on American politics, on global issues. Are there other folks out there in different countries doing a show sort of like yours, or is yours unique in that respect?
At least in my experience, I feel like I'm pretty unique. People tell me that they haven't run across something. I also get the criticism or just the question of, hey, why don't you include more global history? And I've done it where it's useful to American politics. I really think that's the theater where I need to be operating on, and others can take on things. I did a series, for instance, Umbrella Man, about Neville Chamberlain. But that's really because the issue is American. The issue is war and peace and the use of the Munich metaphor. So I had to go into England, and that was a lot of research for me because my natural tendencies towards American politics. And there are a lot of good programs, History on Fire podcast, of course, Dan Carlin, Hardcore History. I mean, great stuff there. And there's one more. When Diplomacy Fails is a really good podcast and delving into history. But generally, historians don't do this. This is kind of taboo. I think it's changing. I have historians interviewed on my podcast, and they all seem to tell me that they like this concept of what I'm doing. But I think for a while it was very taboo. Historians do not get into this politics. But my feelings, like the philosopher Michel Foucault said when they asked him why he was getting involved in politics as a philosopher, why would I not?
Yeah.
What if you're not using it for something? What are we doing? Are we just wearing, trifold hats and reenacting things, that's useful. Good to know. History's great. It's entertaining. There's good stories. But I think not using it for context and continuing a discussion about politics informed by history, rather than setting oneself off like a hermit, not involved in politics at all, is, I think is the more useful way. But it's very difficult. That's why I don't think you'll see too many. Very difficult to do, to blend the two. A lot of work. Weeks go into each of the large podcasts. It's a little easier now that I've been doing it for 11 years, that I have some knowledge. I could just know where to go. Have kind of an index of American history in my brain. I don't have a photographic memory, but I know where to go, and okay, I can go to that book for this issue.
Right.
But it's hard.
Yeah. I mean, it's perfectly understandable why you focus on American politics. You're an American, so I would expect, somebody doing a show like yours, covering, say, British history or whatever, to be from that particular country. So that's. I was just curious because, like I said, I had that idea so many years ago, and it came back to me like a year or so after the Arab Spring, because I heard a podcast where they were talking about the year of revolutions in 19th century Europe, where all these European countries threw off their oppressive governments, and then a year later they were all under a government that was just as bad or worse than the one they threw off.
Well, right. I think that I think it's very common, actually, for the political casts or in any political discussion for people to do this ad hoc without realizing what they're doing. I think it's almost always a lot of discussion of history, and I think that's actually where my podcast came from. The genesis is more from the political side, even though I love history. It wasn't a history podcast that delved into politics. It was a politics podcast that brought in history, because I felt every time I was having political discussions with anyone, I would start bringing up history, and eventually people were like, wow, yeah, that's a good insight. I do feel that too often political discussions bring in history of maybe, if we're lucky, 10 years.
Yeah.
And 10 years isn't what it used to be. So now we're talking about a year before Obama, Yeah. So it's we're not even bringing up the 90s sometimes, and I think it's as long as you have the mentality that the future can change. I mean, look at what Trump's done to politics. The future can certainly be different. No one could have predicted that. I got it wrong. I had Trump as a kind of Will Rogers. I did an episode about comparing him to Will Rogers, then comparing him to Huey Long, which is, I think, closer. But, he's changed things. The future can always be different, but even in when things are a little jumbled or chaotic, the history helps more than it hurts.
Yeah. It gives you perspective, and it gives you an idea of ways to take things, or a different view, so that something which appears bad now may not actually be bad based on what you've learned from history.
Exactly. I mean, I don't do predictions that much in the cast, but there's certain things you can put things in a range of possibilities easier. Midterms are a good predictor. Usually a president loses seats in a midterm. Doesn't mean they lose the House. Usually presidents are reelected.
Yeah. Those
are two very important predictions for people right now, that they're going to want to, they're either love or hate. Usually a president's got to get done what they get done in the beginning of their term. And that's why I think, this is dangerous for President Trump. He's now in July. I mean, it's not over. I mean, a lot of Reagan's bills didn't get passed until September or October, but by October, Reagan's first year, as popular as he was starting to suffer a bit. People were starting to rebel. He had Washington in his hand for the first 8 months. I mean, getting shot, of course,
that helped,
was a factor. But so those are trends that you can apply in any situation. Even a president who's, on Twitter at 3 a.m. using a mechanism that didn't exist 10 years ago, or using various new techniques, really confronting the media aggressively, creating their own news channels, like all of these things. There's still some basics of the presidency you have to that can help you get context.
Now, having heard your All of Politics is Social episode, where you laid out some ideas for the Democratic Party to attempt if they want to beat the tradition of a president being reelected, do you think that the Democratic Party is moving in the right direction, or do they still seem to be a disorganized mess like they were after the election?
Disorganized mess, and it couldn't matter less, by the way, to give you a hopeful note for the 2018 midterms, based on my analysis of history, because parties have won midterms in a jumble of different ideas. The 1918 midterm, Woodrow Wilson lost seats, lost the House and the Senate, devastating for the rest of his presidency. Theodore Roosevelt was saying one thing to the east of the country, another thing to the west. We're going to win the war on one side. He's too harsh on Germany with the German Americans in the Midwest. So that happens all the time. 2006, I'm against the war in Iraq, or I just feel like it's not being fought the right way. That's what won the House. So with that caveat that actually it could be a good thing even for a midterm contest, not good for a presidential contest, by the way, to be a jumbled party. Yeah, I think they're jumbled. They're not really taking some of the suggestions I have. Look, President Trump's killing you on media. Yeah. All right. Every day he owns the media story. If I put my DNC hat on, if I'm like James Carville now, yeah. I'm going to try to do, but I think that they need a media strategy. They're not in the news every day, and they're getting cornered and they're getting defined by opponents. It's still a very strong party. The millions of votes, not only that Hillary Clinton got, but if you also look at the third-party candidates, I mean, this is a minority president and didn't really get that many more votes than Mitt Romney in a lot of these states, but happened to win the states because of the lack of votes, write-in votes, Gary Johnson votes. It's still a very strong Democratic Party, really arguably a majority party. It is split a bit. That's a problem. But they've also got no media game. So some of the things I suggested are, if I was running the party, I would have Iowa now. To get every time you turn on that TV and the president is on the news screen, the DNC has lost. And I don't know if they look at it that way. It doesn't appear to me based on their behavior that they do. But he's on all the time. They're not. You start Iowa early. I know it's a radical step. I know a lot of people aren't going to like it. A lot of candidates aren't going to like it. Too bad. This is what we're doing. We can have Iowa early. We'll keep New Hampshire the same time. But I want the media event of people starting to run now. If this is a resistance, then resist. Have an opposite campaign. Right now, nobody knows who's even going to be leading the party. And there's no one to kind of get behind. And there's no way for the various factions to express themselves. So I think that's troubling for them. Little things like you're in an area where it's probably a little difficult to be a Democrat. Yeah. That's where the politics being social is so important. And they've got to turn that around. So the other thing I think is look at how many celebrities support the Democratic Party. Think about that for a second. And how many congressional districts are there? 435. You think there are 435 celebrities in Hollywood? I think so. You can't get one in every congressional district? No, instead they're doing parties in New York and L.A. That's not going to help. In fact, the way that the media is gamed right now, that's going to hurt you. Every time you do one of those galas and fundraisers, they're going to point to that and say the elitists. Yeah. But when you get George Clooney in Cincinnati, now people want to come to a rally. People want to come to the local Democratic club. Use what you got. Yeah. No, I don't think they're listening to any of those ideas from that podcast. That's a shame. I was really hoping they were listening.
Well, every official from the Democratic Party I've met here in the state, I have told them about your podcast, and as soon as I say the name, they've got their phones out downloading it. So there's a
Thank
chance.
you. That's much. I really do appreciate that. And podcast, by the way, and this is true, I'm sure for your own, is it's all about word of mouth. Everything we've gotten has been word of mouth. I rarely have been able to advertise, and only recently has there been any media attention for my podcast. In 2008, when I said John McCain, age wouldn't be a factor in the 2008 election, predicting that he'd probably be all right for 2 terms. You only have to worry about 1, really.
Yeah.
And the party can nominate someone else if something. So I predicted that age wouldn't be a factor in the election, and that went in the New York Times. And I'm glad that prediction has proven true. God bless him. Hope for his health. And but he would have been a president, and already well into the next president still living.
Yeah.
So that got in the New York Times. But other than that, not a lot of media attention.
Although I will say that being president is probably a little more stressful than being a senator. So,
yeah, I thought about that. True, healthcare's awfully good. There's an urgent care in the White House essentially at all times. Ambulance travels with the motorcade at all times. The White House physician, good doctors, drugs are better. He would have had to limit his activities. He would be no Obama, that's for sure. He would have had to do. This is where this gets into a little bit of this, like how you organize a White House, and he would have needed a good chief of staff who could have held people at the door. Yeah. The current president's having a little trouble with that. Now, he's got a different kind of metabolism or, endocrinial system. I mean, he's, I don't know what he's doing, whether there's, he just doesn't sleep, I guess. I mean, but that doesn't work well. That's another thing that history's just going to tell you. I mean, you can tell me that it's super Trump, that he's an amazing guy and he's different from everybody else, but every other president that tried that one, including people like Kennedy, Jimmy Carter, nuclear engineer, great mind, great systems mind, could not run every meeting in the way he wanted. Bill Clinton tried that, like early couple of months. Spokes of the wheel. Everybody can report to me. Anybody can walk into my office. I'll run every meeting. The staff's not important. History does not have good things to say about that. So that's how you balance this. We can always say, hey, this guy's an exception, but when you start looking at the historical examples, it takes the personality away from things and the partisanship a little bit away from things. It's like, look, I'm not judging him as a partisan, but this spokes of the wheel thing, this management style, a weak chief of staff isn't going to work, and now he appears to have a stronger one. We'll see how it works.
To go back to your episode, All Politics is Social, have you ever read a book called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer?
No, but I've heard the name.
Yeah, he's a self-taught sociologist, basically. And I reread that book in October, and it seemed to me like it was the Trump playbook. And hearing that episode of your podcast, it sounded to me like you were drawing from some of his ideas. I mean, he lays it out sort of like how you do your podcast in a very neutral fashion. He's not saying, well, a populist movement is automatically going to lead to a terrible government or a good government.
Right.
He just gives the examples, and that is one of the really remarkable things about your podcast is how unbiased you tend to be.
Yeah, and I have opinions. I always point that out. And for instance, I'm a big healthcare supporter. But some of my opinions are more general things like turnout and the civility in politics. The thing we were talking about earlier, I'm a proponent of a peace, things like that, more general concepts. But I try to keep it because otherwise I think, you lose audience, and I have an audience on, I like to think on both sides of the spectrum. It's probably more center-left to the audience, but it's both sides, really. And then also I think that history has a way of winding down that strict partisanship. I mean, the more and more you read it, and you just see how things were in the past and the imperfectness of things. So a lot of times I'm really against, on both sides, the purity politics. Yeah. Everything has to be pure, but it never was. It never was. I mean, you go back to my podcast about all the money Lincoln raised. writes a letter to a guy in Connecticut in 1862, or I should say in New York, about the Connecticut elections. We're in quite a jam. We need money soon. I mean, that's how it was done, or raising money from the Navy Yard in Brooklyn. Every president's goal, whether they were Lincoln, Andy Johnson, or whoever in the past. There's no perfection, and so history, I think, helps with that, because a lot of the sharp partisanship comes from a basic mentality of, I know better than you, and if I had my way, things would be better. But history tends to get rid of a lot of that feeling.
Yeah. Just a couple of more questions, because I know you got to go. Something that comes up in various discussions I've had, and since you're doing that series on President Ronald Reagan, what do you think about the claims that he was suffering from Alzheimer's in the latter part of his second term? Is there merit to him, or do you think that, no, he was as well as a man at his age could be expected to be?
That's a thing. I think that he was older already, which makes it harder to judge. It's possible that some very, very early signs could have been showing. People have, for instance, analyzed the diaries, and I have to say people have. I'm almost sounding like the president when I say that. People have looked at this, but only because I haven't done it myself. I've read articles about it, that if you look at the beginning, first term, and then the second term in the diary, there's less activity. Does happen sometimes with a lot of presidents, of course. The staff starts to do more. They've got things more organized. I think he was president at all times. I think that he was able to perform the role in the way that he could add value to it, and particularly in the communications end of things. And that as a manager, well, one of his good friends, Tom Reed, had said, he's really not a good manager. Now, it's not something that you normally say about your friend, the president of the United States. But obviously it was those other skills that made his presidency successful when it was. And I don't think those ever faded. One of the things that Howard Baker did in 1987, so this would have been a year before he was, his last year in office, was before he took the chief of staff job, is he had his aides come in and stand in the Oval Office at different directions. And he and his aides, while Reagan was talking, they were all making observations. And they felt that he was alert, acute, able to respond, warm, that he overall, I think Reagan overall thought more than what people thought at the time or think now. No. People would be amazed because he was also one of these listeners. Right? Very rare for politicians. Most of them come out of the bar. You got to keep talking. Hey, judge, my motion. That's what he didn't come from Congress. Reagan was a guy that would sit there at a meeting, take notes, sometimes doodle because he already knew the answer, already had read. He read a lot. And then people would be amazed when he responded because he would talk and he had obviously read the material and knew the material, So while that being said, I mean, it's certainly possible, and there's no doubt that there was a bit of a drift off in activity in the later years. You have to ask the question, will that be true of any older person in the White House?
Well, and it could also be a side effect of him being shot, because he had to undergo pretty major surgery, so that tends to impact people who are older.
Yeah, he was in very good shape. The surgeons who performed on him, the guy who had to cut through his chest to get the bullet, just said that it was one of the hardest cases he had for a man his age. I mean, he was in very good shape. He used to chop wood at the ranch. And so one of the things Tip O'Neill said, I've heard this story so many times, I'm going to try it. So he went to his backyard or whatever in Massachusetts and started trying to chop, and he chopped like 3 times and he was out of breath. So Reagan was in very good shape, and that's why he survived. That's one of the reasons he survived the shooting. Let us never forget it was also a .22 caliber bullet, the smallest, one of the smallest available, and not the type of weaponry that's out there now.
Yeah. Okay. To wrap up here, is there one element of the Trump administration which you think people aren't paying attention to that they should, based on your understanding of history?
Yeah. Good question to ask. There's 2 things that are coming to mind. One thing is, watch the triangulation. Obama never triangulated. You never heard Obama say, this is the Democratic Congress and I need Congress to pass this, acting like he was some other player. He was always the quarterback of the Democratic Party. Trump doesn't have that. And then once healthcare reform or repeal and replace starts failing, you hear him start making comments about Republicans in Congress, attacking them in some cases, and not just attacking the ones that didn't support him, but also attacking the failure a little bit. But he also triangulated in calling it a mean plan, calling, Paul Ryan's plan like a mean plan at one point, and in saying in a rally, I told him, add a little more money. Republican president, add a little bit more money. It's been limited. See, it's not the dominant political action that's going on, but it's something to watch. Watch that triangulation, because I think the GOP party starts failing. Don't expect Trump to join in the failure. This is the guy that absolutely does not want that. If there's any failure, he's going to create a sheen that there isn't. That's the Trump way. That's always been the way. One of the books I read was not Art of the Deal. I read Art of the Comeback back in the 90s. It's a great book, actually. Very enjoyable book. But it was about when Trump was down and how he came back. And I think he was more honest in that book. I noticed that it's not reprinted as much as the others during his presidential campaign. But in any case, so watch that triangulation. Watch him maybe start to work with some moderate Democrats down the line. It's probably not going to happen until late 2018, 2019. And then the second thing to watch is, where's Reagan? Does anybody talk about Reagan You notice that in the Trump era, I don't see Republicans idolizing Ronald Reagan as much, because Trump requires some of that oxygen. And I wonder if there's going to be a conflict pretty soon between the old, Reagan Republicans and the new kind of Trump Republicans, because he's a figure that's just as dominating as Reagan. If you're a Trump supporter, that's the hero. May not be room for 2 heroes. So those are 2 kind of general things that I think I'm watching.
I know that in my own experience, just over the years, whatever the big issue is at the start of some president's administration, by the time the next president rolls around, everybody has completely forgotten about it. In most cases, Afghanistan and Iraq being notable exceptions, but we weren't.
It's absolutely true. Yeah,
we weren't talking about Afghanistan and Iraq, when Clinton was running, or even when George W. Bush was running, and yet, everything else that we had been discussing just kind of got left behind because of the events of 9/11 and the Iraq War. So,
if you look at the Clinton presidency, he started all gangbusters for national health care and some really big economic issues. And when he ran for re-election, he ended up with these little pop gun type issues, school uniforms and V-chips, things we wouldn't even think about now. And it was a very different presidency that played out. And while small reforms in healthcare were made, and in other issues, family leave and other issues that I always say big is small. So, I mean, small is big, I should say. You got to watch these little issues. It really didn't match what he said. So here, of course, everyone's watching North Korea and what could happen with that. This is not a president who's going to tolerate someone insulting him. So that's a little different than if another person was president. For a country like that seems to thrive off that kind of thing. And you heard about infrastructure, you heard about tax cuts. I think that you're seeing that in early presidencies where you got to get everything done, and the fact that his first big initiative was repeal and replace, and it's August now. I don't know if you're going to see infrastructure. I don't know unless he goes in and unless Schumer comes to the White House, which right now I don't see it. Maybe 2019.
Okay. Well, why don't you tell everybody where they can find your show, and let me thank you again for being on it.
Oh, great to be on. Thanks. It's www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com, or you can find us on Apple Podcasts. Just look for My History Can Beat Up Your Politics.
All right. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fuzz-Nuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.